Hello dearies, it's me again, Menopause Taylor, bringing you the thorough, non-biased, factual education on menopause that all women deserve. Unfortunately, a complete education on menopause includes learning about various diseases. So I just present them all, addressing each one in a unit dedicated solely to it. And this is the unit on breast cancer. And breast cancer is a hot, unpleasant topic on everybody's mind. But as with everything else, having a true education on it will make you better able to manage your menopause in accordance with your goals, including your goal of avoiding breast cancer. But you can't avoid something you don't understand. So this is video number 367, and it's the 12th video in the unit on breast cancer. And it's on the differences between hereditary and non-hereditary breast cancer. You will not find a separate section on hereditary versus non-hereditary breast cancer in the breast cancer chapter of my book. There, I address only non-hereditary breast cancer as it pertains to the vast majority of women. But here, I'm going to make sure you know the differences between hereditary breast cancers, which are caused directly by a gene mutation, and non-hereditary breast cancers, which are due to unknown causes and to various risk factors for breast cancer. You know that I like to start with a review, and if you're wondering why I do that, it's because I know that this education on menopause in general and breast cancer in particular is foreign to you. It's a lot to learn. And remember, have you noticed how thick my book is? How many times during this educational endeavor have you been shocked to discover how much there is to learn? Haven't you seen why it's so unacceptable to deny women an education on this stuff? And let's not pretend that every woman is watching these videos in order. Those of you who do certainly understand why I implore you to do so. But there will always be a few people who are blindly cavalier enough to think that they can actually get this education by watching my videos in random order. And while I will never cater to such a ridiculous notion, I will always orient you to the topic of discussion. So, back in video number 318 in the unit on cancer in general, I presented a tutorial on hereditary versus non-hereditary cancers in general. Today, we'll narrow that to breast cancer in particular. And we'll compare and contrast a number of factors for the two. In video 318 in the cancer in general unit, I made a chart of the general differences between all hereditary versus non-hereditary cancers. Today, we'll add to it and tailor it to breast cancer specifically. If you've been watching my videos in order, you will find this a bit familiar. In the first column, I've listed all the factors that I compared and contrasted between hereditary and non-hereditary cancers in the unit on cancer in general. In the second column, I've designated the details for hereditary breast cancers specifically. And in the third column, I've designated the details for non-hereditary breast cancers specifically. And we'll use the same chart to discuss these factors as they pertain to hereditary versus non-hereditary breast cancer. You see that the first item listed on the chart is the beginning. After that, you see the item listed as damage. And third, you see number of mutant genes. We'll discuss these three together. So we'll start by discussing the origins of breast cancer. In the unit on cancer in general, I taught you that every cancer starts with just one single cell that begins to divide uncontrollably. Normally, there are genes in your chromosomes that prevent this uncontrolled division of cells. It's almost as if you have genes that function as traffic lights. And these traffic light genes are just like the red and green lights on this model. The red light means stop, and the green light means go. Well, in oncology, there are more sophisticated terms for these stop and go signals. Suppressor genes are genes that prevent production of harmful products. They're the red light. Promoter genes are genes that enable production of beneficial products. They're the green light. This interplay between suppressor and promoter genes exists with both hereditary and non-hereditary breast cancers. What differs is the origin of the loss of control that results in cancer. With hereditary breast cancer, the origin of the cancer is a gene mutation. You can think of a gene mutation as a mean gene. It's an abnormal gene that you get from one of your parents in the 23 chromosomes he or she donates to you. Well, because you inherit it as one of the 23 chromosomes, it's a predisposition to breast cancer that you incur before conception. So the possibility of breast cancer is present when you're born. In video number 318, I used these scarves to demonstrate this. These represent the two sets of chromosomes you inherit from your parents. So, this one is normal, but this one carries a mean gene or a genetic mutation, and this knot represents the mutation. But the origin of non-hereditary breast cancer is different. With non-hereditary breast cancer, both of your chromosomes are perfectly normal at the time of conception and birth. There are no mean genes. There are no knots anywhere. Both are perfectly normal. So non-hereditary breast cancer begins after conception. What happens is that as you live your life, you encounter things here and there that serve to damage your once perfect genes. Such potentially damaging agents include mere aging, dietary choices, sedentary lifestyle, obesity, smoking, alcohol, radiation exposure. And the damage occurs slowly over time. But instead of just one gene incurring a mutation, multiple genes are affected. You see, your various genes control different functions in your body. And you have red light and green light genes for just about everything your body does. So any of the genes that control any of these potentially damaging agents can incur damage. And when that particular gene gets damaged, it becomes mean. And the pertinent risk factor then increases your risk for breast cancer. Most commonly, no single gene actually causes the cancer. Instead, multiple damaged genes cause it. So, instead of having just one gene mutation like this, as is the case with hereditary breast cancer, you end up with multiple genes that are mutated. One may have been damaged due to, say, your dietary changes. And then, later on, another may have been damaged by your sedentary lifestyle. Later, a third may have been damaged by alcohol. and fourth, by obesity. No one of these creates enough damage to cause breast cancer all by itself. But together, they disrupt the normal functioning of your red lights and green lights to ultimately result in breast cancer. So this means that for hereditary versus non-hereditary breast cancer, there is a difference in both the origin of the cancer and in how many genes contribute to it. So that covers the first three items on our chart: how the cancer begins, damage to genes, and the number of mutant genes. And that brings us to the next factor that is different between hereditary and non-hereditary breast cancers: age. With hereditary breast cancer, you're born with the mean gene. So you have the potential for developing breast cancer from the start. And it's like a great big head start. And because of the head start, it may not take much for cancer to develop. You start out with this: one normal gene and one abnormal gene. Now, this alone does not mean you will get breast cancer, but it does mean that all it takes to get breast cancer is for this other gene on the normal chromosome to become damaged. And if it does, you end up with this. Well, what's this other gene? Same gene is damaged on both chromosomes, you get breast cancer. And this is likely to happen at a young age. This is why hereditary breast cancer occurs at a younger age than non-hereditary breast cancer. It doesn't require as much further damage to give it the green light. Likewise, it doesn't require as much time. Hereditary breast cancers occur in women as young as age 20. For them, this is not a disease of aging. But with non-hereditary breast cancer, you start out with two completely normal chromosomes bearing no mean gene mutations. And you have to incur enough different episodes of gene damage in enough different genes to get breast cancer. And that takes time. But it's not until there is damage to the same gene on both chromosomes that breast cancer develops. So, you might incur some damage to a gene on one chromosome in your 20s. Then, you might incur some damage to a gene on another chromosome in your 30s. Eventually, you might incur some damage to a gene on another chromosome in your 40s. And in your 50s, you might finally incur damage to a gene on one chromosome that is already damaged on another chromosome. So this and this have chromosome damage in the same location. So you've finally gotten two genes that are damaged in the same spot. None of the single damaged genes was enough in and of itself to create breast cancer, but the duplication of damage to the same gene on both chromosomes gave it the green light. So the incidence of non-hereditary breast cancer increases with age. This is the kind of breast cancer that most women need to concern themselves with at the time of menopause. The next big factor that differs between hereditary and non-hereditary breast cancer is your actual risk of ever getting the cancer. The risk of ever getting a hereditary breast cancer is much, much higher than the risk of ever getting a non-hereditary breast cancer. And the risk varies greatly depending on the particular gene mutation you have. I'll be telling you about the different gene mutations in the next video, but for now, I'll just designate the risk range as 29 to 85%. Now that's a vast range, but it's also a higher risk overall than the risk for non-hereditary breast cancer. The risk of non-hereditary breast cancer is generally 14%. These risk figures for both hereditary and non-hereditary breast cancer are the risk over a lifetime. And of course, they are not absolute. The next factor of comparison is the degree of susceptibility to breast cancer. And this is all about risk factors. Interestingly, this degree of susceptibility factor does not differ between hereditary and non-hereditary breast cancer. In both situations, your degree of susceptibility is what determines whether or not you actually end up with breast cancer. Think about it. With hereditary breast cancer, you are born with a gene mutation. But a gene mutation is not the disease. It's just a mean gene that may or may not ever hit you. So it's up to the risk factors for breast cancer to either give you breast cancer or prevent breast cancer. And this is why learning everything I'll be teaching you later about how to prevent breast cancer is so important. People vary in their susceptibility to agents that can induce cancer. Some people can withstand a lot of exposure or damage before control over cell division is lost, while other people have a very low threshold for transformation into cancer cells. Even if you're born with a genetic mutation that gives you a head start on the possibility of getting breast cancer, your degree of susceptibility and exposure to the risk factors will determine whether or not you ever get breast cancer. And the very same thing is true for non-hereditary breast cancer. In that case, you aren't born with a gene mutation, but the risk factors and exposures to cancer-causing agents will determine whether or not you actually ever get the disease. And again, people vary in terms of their susceptibility. Some people can withstand a lot of exposure to damage before control over cell division is lost, while others have a very low threshold for transformation into cancer cells. This is why some smokers can smoke 2 packs of cigarettes a day for 50 years and never get lung cancer, while others can smoke only half a pack a day for just 10 years and get it. The next big difference between hereditary and non-hereditary breast cancer is consideration of the number of cells that bear the mutant gene. In other words, is the mutation localized to one cell, or is it present in all cells? This is a distinction that will become very important when it comes to genetic testing. With hereditary breast cancer, you've got a genetic mutation that is present in all the cells of your body. And this is because you were born with the mutation. And at birth, every cell of your body has your set of 23 chromosomes, one from your mom and one from your dad. So every single cell carries the mutation. But that is not the case with non-hereditary breast cancer. In non-hereditary breast cancer, there is a repetitive genetic damage to many different genes in just one cell that ultimately becomes a cancer cell. This goes back to the basic principle that all cancers begin as one single cell that loses control and becomes a cancer cell. So that one cancer cell carries the mutation and just grows out of control. But your other cells are normal. Closely related to the number of mutant cells is the number of organs that carry the mutant cell. For hereditary breast cancer, all your organs carry the genetic mutation. This goes back to the basic principle that every cell in your body carries the same set of 23 chromosomes. Well, all of your organs are collections of cells. So by default, if all the cells contain the genetic mutation, then all of your organs can carry the genetic mutation. So with hereditary breast cancer, the mutant gene is present in all your organs, although the cancer begins in your breast. But with non-hereditary breast cancer, just one single cell in one single organ incurs enough genetic damage that it, and it alone, forms a cancer cell. So a single breast cell becomes damaged enough to get the green light and lose control, growing wildly. But if you do genetic testing on the cells in the other organs of your body, you will not find the mutation. It's only in your breast cells, and it's only in the breast cells that have become cancerous. The next factor that differs between hereditary and non-hereditary breast cancer is inheritance. In other words, it's the ability or lack thereof to pass the mutant gene on to your children. Now, this is an area that is really, really clear-cut. But because of all the fear of breast cancer, the distinctions in heritability between hereditary and non-hereditary breast cancer just keep getting murkier and murkier. And this is based on fear, not on logic or science. With hereditary cancers, obviously you inherit them. That's because you get 50% of your genes from your mom and 50% of your genes from your dad. If one of your parents donated a genetic mutation to you for breast cancer, you have it on one of your 2 chromosomes. You received this from one parent and this from the other parent. Well, the same thing occurs again when you have children. You donate one of your 2 sets of each of the 23 chromosomes to your child. If you carry a genetic mutation, it will be present on one of the pair. But you only donate one of the pair to your child. This means your child has a 50% chance of inheriting your mutation. If these are my 2 chromosomes, I'm going to donate either this one or this one. One has the genetic mutation. The other does not. So my child has a 50% chance of getting the genetic mutation for hereditary breast cancer, regardless of whether or not I have ever actually had breast cancer. But with non-hereditary breast cancer, neither of my chromosomes has a mutant gene. They're both perfectly normal. So there is 0 chance that I'll donate a genetic mutation to my child, even if I have had breast cancer. My breast cancer was due to repetitive cellular damage that occurred during my lifetime. It has not affected the genes I donate to my child. The reason I said this is an area that keeps getting murkier and murkier is that instead of making this clear distinction between hereditary breast cancer and non-hereditary breast cancer, most doctors and patients are treating all breast cancer as if it's hereditary. Remember, your personal risk factors for breast cancer are solely what determine your risk for breast cancer if you do not have a gene mutation. So why are women with a family history of breast cancer but no gene mutation being treated as if they have a mutation? I'll tell you why. Misplaced fear on the parts of both physicians and patients. That's why. People have turned the breast cancer beast into an even bigger beast than it actually is. The next factor to consider is genetic testing for hereditary versus non-hereditary breast cancer. Now this factor is greatly different between the two. And I like to think of the difference in terms of timing. One is genetic testing before you get cancer. The other is genetic testing after you get cancer. For hereditary breast cancer, genetic testing is done before you get cancer. You are testing for increased hereditary susceptibility to a cancer. You want to determine if you have a mutant gene that you inherited from one of your parents. So a gene would be present in all of your cells and in all of your organs. It would increase your risk of getting cancer, and you would have a 50% chance of passing it on to each of your children. But non-hereditary genetic testing for breast cancer is completely different. With non-hereditary genetic testing for breast cancer, you would get tested after you have the cancer. And instead of testing for a mutation that you inherited from your mom or dad, you are testing for the genetic features of the cancer itself. You want to determine the personality of your cancer so that you can make decisions about treatment and anticipate your prognosis. These mutant genes will only be present in the cancer cells in the one organ where the cancer began. And the genetic testing says nothing about your hereditary risk of getting that or any other kind of cancer. But it does help dictate treatment. This is the kind of testing you do to determine whether your breast cancer is hormone receptor positive or hormone receptor negative. So these two types of genetic testing actually serve two completely different purposes. Next, we have the incidence and prevalence of hereditary versus non-hereditary breast cancer. In other words, how common are they? On this, they are vastly different. Hereditary breast cancer accounts for only 5 to 10% of breast cancers. In other words, it's fairly rare. And heritability follows patterns that are based on race and ethnicity. Non-hereditary breast cancer accounts for 90 to 95% of breast cancers. And these cancers do not follow patterns of race and ethnicity. They don't even occur in families to the extent assumed by most people. So be sure to make this distinction. This is another area that keeps getting murkier and murkier with all the distorted fear of breast cancer. The next factor that is different between hereditary and non-hereditary breast cancers is screening. You've probably heard of breast cancer screening guidelines, and you've probably heard of changes in these guidelines from time to time. And I'll be addressing all of this in future videos. But for now, I want to point out some differences in screening for hereditary and non-hereditary breast cancers. Always think of screening as a means of finding a disease early. While the guidelines do not always serve that purpose well, that is, by definition, the purpose of screening. For hereditary breast cancer, you have to consider screening that will discover a cancer in a younger woman. So regardless of the screening guidelines for non-hereditary breast cancer, You have to start screening earlier, and you have to screen more frequently. So if the normal starting age for screening is 40, you might want to start screening at age 30 or 35 instead. And if the normal frequency is screening every 2 years, you might want to screen every year instead. The screening guidelines for non-hereditary breast cancers are always based on the entire population and on money. So while they may be considered standard, they are not an edict. Depending on your risk factors for breast cancer, you too may wish to adjust those. If you're at high risk, you may want to get screening earlier and more often. If you're at low risk, you may want to get screening later and less often. I'm a big believer in peace of mind. Do whatever gives you peace of mind. And the same thing goes for screening techniques. In later videos, I'll teach you about the different machines that are available for breast cancer screening, because mammograms are only one of them. Regardless of whether you are addressing hereditary or non-hereditary breast cancer, there are many, many options for screening techniques. The final factor that differs between hereditary and non-hereditary breast cancers is prevention. Obviously, you want to prevent both, and there are many ways to prevent both, but the extremes differ greatly. Prevention of hereditary breast cancer can involve surgical procedures that would be excessive in other situations. For instance, it is not uncommon for a woman with a gene mutation for breast cancer to have a prophylactic bilateral mastectomy, which means removing both breasts. Another common surgical means of prevention of hereditary breast cancer is removal of both ovaries. These are both measures that involve risk, but for the woman who chooses them because of hereditary breast cancer mutations, they also provide great benefit. Prophylactic bilateral mastectomy can reduce breast cancer risk by 90%. Prophylactic removal of both ovaries can reduce breast cancer by 50%. It is also quite common for a woman with a genetic mutation for breast cancer to take a chemotherapeutic drug prophylactically in order to reduce her risk for breast cancer. These are the same drugs used for treating the actual cancer, even though she doesn't have actual cancer. Such extreme measures are not as common with non-hereditary breast cancer. However, with the rampant fear of breast cancer, they are becoming more and more common for that too. Of course, there's a vast array of more conservative and less invasive measures for preventing breast cancer, and most of these are as simple as adopting a good diet and good lifestyle habits. These benefit everyone regardless of their genes. So, were you aware of so many differences between hereditary and non-hereditary breast cancer? This chart is your summary. And if you want a copy of it, you can get one by clicking on the link in the description box below this screen, or you can go to menopausetailor.me. If you want to read more about the genetics of breast cancer, this is an excellent book. It's called Assess Your True Risk of Breast Cancer. It's written by a geneticist, Patricia T. Kelly, PhD. It's not ultra current. The copyright is the year 2000, but the principles of genetics are still accurate, and it may give you some peace of mind. Notice that I did not get into any specific hereditary breast cancer today, and that's because you needed this comparative perspective first. But next week, I'll delve into the genetic basis of the hereditary breast cancers themselves. I sure hope you're taking advantage of this education, because I sure do spend a lot of time making sure it is just right for you. And if you want to tailor all of your menopause management options to those that are just right for you, schedule a consultation with me at Menopause Tailor. I cannot do in any comment box what I can do in a consultation for helping you. There is nothing better for getting just what you need right now. And if you subscribe to my newsletter, you'll receive interesting tidbits every 2 weeks along with promos and discounts. The social media stuff is just for fun. Bye!